Have you ever been under pressure to pay tithes because you thought you were defrauding God of your money? Have you heard that you will not be allowed to enter the gates of heaven if you do not contribute? What if I told you that the church never fully explained the tithing to you? In actuality, a lot of Christians give their money out of duty rather than love because they are plagued by guilt and anxiety. Even worse, some think that God will punish them if they don't pay. Today, however, you will learn 3 biblical tithing secrets that will revolutionize the way you think about this custom. You may be shocked by what you're about to hear, but it may also permanently restore your faith. Stay with me through to the finish, because what I'm about to share has the power to permanently alter your spiritual life. So if you want to know whether you're being duped or if you really have a duty before God, pay attention. In the Old Testament, the tithe was more than simply a financial arrangement. It was a system of communal support. Many people think of the tithe as a straightforward financial transaction, a kind of holy homage given to the church. But did God truly intend that? As we go further into the Bible, we see that the tithe was much more than just money from the beginning. It played a crucial role in the organization of Israelite society in the Old Testament. The tithe was not just a religious duty, as many people believe, nor was it a set and distinct sum. It was a system of supply that supported the Levites and the poor, as well as the religious celebrations that bolstered the community's unity and faith. Determining how God really wants us to handle our belongings and our charity requires an understanding of this basis. For instance, according to Numbers 18:24, the Levites were the only tribe not to inherit land. Serving at the temple, attending to spiritual affairs, and bringing the people before God were all part of their mission. But how could they live if they had no land to cultivate or animals to raise? God supplied for them via the tithe, making sure that those who devoted their life to holy service were never overlooked or forgotten. An important lesson is already taught by this. God never forsakes those who put their all into his mission. However, should this procedure be carried out in the same manner today? The fact that there were several forms of tithe is another intriguing feature. The so-called triennial tithe, which is to be saved to help widows, orphans, and foreigners, is mentioned in Deuteronomy 14, verses 28 to 29. This demonstrates a profound aspect of God's character. He is concerned about the weakest members of society. In addition to supporting religious leaders, the tithes serve as a social justice mechanism that gave the poor access to resources and dignity. Imagine living in a society where everyone contributes and there is no hunger due to a shared dedication to everyone's welfare. The heavenly suggestion was that the tithe served 3 purposes: worship and celebration, as well as aiding the Levites and the poor. According to Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 to 27, a portion of the tithe was used for religious celebrations, acts of thanksgiving, and worship. In front of the Lord, the people would assemble to eat and rejoice, recognizing that he was the source of all food. The idea that the tithe was a dry and onerous duty is disproved by this. It was really closely related to happiness, camaraderie, and thankfulness. God created his commandments to educate his people to rely on him with trust and satisfaction, not to be a burden. Now consider the difference between this and the way the tithe is now offered. Under the danger of curses, it has turned into a burden in certain regions. However, the Bible demonstrates that the tithe's original intent was much more profound and significant. It was a manifestation of justice, love, and collective provision rather than only a heavenly tax. The dilemma that emerges is whether we are adhering to a system that may have deviated from God's original plan, or whether we are really implementing the spirit of the tithe. Another significant finding is that the Old Testament practice of tithing was not restricted to monetary contributions. Harvest, animals, and other products made by the land were all included. To put it another way, God requested that the people lay aside some things that he had supplied. The idea here was steadfastness in acknowledging that all belongs to the Lord, not the precise quantity. This prompts us to consider, is the emphasis on the heart's disposition or its monetary worth today? It's noteworthy to note that, contrary to popular belief, the tithe was only required on individuals who had livestock or agricultural products. In other words, one was not required to pay the tithe if they did not have any crops or livestock. This remark highlights a crucial idea. God never asks someone to do anything they cannot do. Being faithful and appreciative should be a choice, not a burden for those who are already struggling. All of this makes it abundantly evident that the Old Testament tithe was a system of reciprocal care rather than a tool of coercion. It demonstrated God's justice by making sure that the poor were taken care of, the temple servants were maintained, and the bonds between the people were reinforced. What happened to the tithe in the New Testament? However, since it was so significant at the time, did Jesus uphold the standard, or did he provide a fresh viewpoint on giving and charity? We must examine Christ's teachings and how he reinterpreted the idea of giving in order to comprehend this. Moving on to the second point, we shall see how Jesus changed the definition of the tithe and gave us a deeper, more profound perspective on charity. The real offering for Christ, after all, is far more than the amount of money given. Let's examine this potent lesson and learn how to incorporate this idea into our religious lives. Jesus shifted the tithe's emphasis. The heart's aim is more significant than the quantity. Many people think that giving money to the church is a sign of one's commitment to God. But was that what Jesus taught? A powerful example of this is found in Matthew 23, verse 23, where Christ addresses the Pharisees and says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." Jesus does not condemn the tithe per se, but rather the clumsy and meaningless manner in which it was carried out. The lack of a really changed heart was the issue, not the offering. The perfect religion of the Pharisees was well recognized. They were careful to separate even the tiniest herbs from their gardens in order to pay tithes, but they also disregarded far more fundamental values like empathy for the underprivileged, fairness in interpersonal relationships, and sincere belief in God. They erred by being fixated on the ceremony rather than the core of religion. Here, Jesus shows us that God is more concerned with the giver's heart than with statistics. An offering loses its spiritual significance if it is not made from a place of love and appreciation. The tale of the widow who gave her last penny in the temple, Mark 12, verses 41 to 44, further illustrates the same lesson. Jesus called the disciples' attention to a poor lady who offered only 2 little copper pennies, while the wealthy were placing vast amount of money in the offering box. Although her donation seemed modest to the naked sight, Jesus said that the widow had donated more than anybody else. Why? Because she gave from her need, with her heart totally given up to God, rather than from what was left over. The idea that God is moved by lofty ideals is disproved by this text. The purpose of the giving is what counts. Jesus completely changed the way we think about donating. The tithe was a mandated duty and a rule in the Old Testament. Jesus, however, offered an alternative viewpoint. Selfless giving founded on faith and love. According to Christ, the genuine sacrifice is one that originates from a heart full of thankfulness rather than out of dread of retribution or religious tradition. This lesson asks us to consider whether we are contributing because we are following the rules or because we are demonstrating a really changed heart. The fact that Jesus spoke of a much bigger sacrifice rather than just monetary donations is another crucial aspect. During his earthly journey, he taught that giving oneself fully is the highest calling for a disciple of God. Offerings that go far beyond financial gain include serving others, loving one's neighbor, giving to the poor, and forgiving those who wrong us. Are we really prepared to provide our love, time, and attention to others who are in need of encouragement? Offerings in the temple are just one example of how Christ teaches charity. He challenges us to practice generosity in many areas, including patience, hospitality, forgiveness, and caring for others. The time we spend with someone who needs a word of hope might sometimes be the most significant gift we can give, not money. When we get this, we see that giving money is only a tiny portion of what it means to be giving in God's kingdom. It's noteworthy that Jesus never asked his followers to pay a tithe. He never enforced a certain sum, but he spoke about serving, giving, and assisting. This is because, rather than focusing on a mathematical rule, he focused on the disposition of the heart. In the kingdom, generosity functions as a mirror of God's love inside us rather than as a system of charges. Giving is no longer a duty but a luxury when we are filled with that love. For many individuals who live in agony because they believe they must contribute a certain amount in order to satisfy God, this lesson may be freeing. In fact, Jesus never tied financial gain to heavenly favor. He always emphasized obedience and trust as the real routes to leading a prosperous life. God himself promises to supply everything, so anybody who contributes with a proper heart will never be abandoned. Now, how should we think about offerings if the New Testament does not mandate the tithe? Does Jesus and the apostles teach a different way to contribute? The next item will examine how the New Testament presents a paradigm of contribution that is founded on pleasure and freedom rather than fear or duty. The New Testament encourages voluntary giving rather than tithing demands. The idea of contribution was quite different from the Old Testament when we examine the early church and the apostles' teachings. A much more potent principle, voluntary giving driven by love and gratitude, supplanted the legalistic paradigm of the required tithe. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion. For God loves a cheerful giver. The Apostle Paul said unequivocally in his epistle to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 9, verse 7. The new Christian view of offerings is summed up in this text. It is an act of unprompted generosity, free from coercion and manipulation, rather than a set proportion. Throughout the New Testament, this idea of contributing freedom is reiterated. Paul gives the congregation instructions in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2, to allocate their donations based on each member's income. Thus, no one is subject to a precise quantity imposed by God. No one should feel bad about having nothing. Those who have more may give more, and those who have less can give less. The reasoning for this is straightforward. The giving is a loving deed that is proportionate to each person's potential rather than a predetermined requirement. And what was the early church's experience with this practice? All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. This model, which was founded on brotherly love and in which there was a sincere commitment to helping one another, is drastically different from what we see today. Acts 2, verses 44 to 45. There was a genuine want to share, but no pressure. Regretfully, a lot of people nowadays misrepresent the idea of charity and use it as money to trade with God. The Bible does not teach that making substantial offerings is a means of obtaining monetary rewards, despite what some preachers claim. Being generous should be motivated by the knowledge that all we own already originated from God, not by the hope of getting anything in return. Another crucial aspect is that in the New Testament, the offering was used to aid the poor as well as to sustain the established church. For instance, Paul set up collections to help Christians in need, Romans 15, verses 25 to 27. This reaffirms that the goal of Christian contributions is to improve lives, not to elevate religious leaders. When we make an offering, we should always consider if it is serving God's will or just maintaining a human system. We learn the value of having a true heart from a freedom in contributing. The narrative of Ananias and Sapphira, a couple who sold a property and feigned to give the whole price to the church while really keeping a portion for themselves, is told in Acts 5. The falsehood and their desire to give the impression that they were being more giving than they really were the issues, not the fact that they retained some of the money. This demonstrates that God is more pleased by the honesty of the giver's heart than by numerical values. It's noteworthy to note that the apostles never made the tithe a requirement for Christians in the New Testament. Their writings would have undoubtedly reaffirmed it if it were a requirement for salvation or the Christian life. Rather, the focus was always on the sacrifice made voluntarily, free from compulsion or fear of a curse. Therefore, the true issue is not, how much should I give, but what is the condition of my heart when giving? God will accept any contribution, no matter how little, if it is done with love and pleasure. However, it loses its spiritual significance if it is delivered under duress, out of fear, or out of self-interest. In God's kingdom, generosity is determined by one's genuine desire to contribute rather than by numerical values. We might thus infer that the New Testament paradigm is centered on a spirit of giving that ought to pervade every aspect of Christian life, rather than a set tax known as a tenth. Giving money is just one aspect of the problem. Another is leading a life of giving in other respects: time, love, compassion, and service to others. When we realize this, we contribute because we know that God has already given us everything, not because we have to. Thus, we have a greater awareness of divine favor as a result of knowing about the tithe and sacrifices. The real meaning of Christian generosity is that we are expected to give out of love, not out of obligation. Now that you are aware of the reality of the tithing, tell me, have you ever felt compelled to give because you were afraid of upsetting God, or have you always given freely and joyfully? Please leave your thoughts in the comments section. I would truly appreciate hearing them. If this material opened your eyes, make sure you subscribe to the channel and enable alerts before leaving, since the lessons you get here have the power to really change your spiritual life. Don't stop here, then. Discover another amazing biblical truth that the church failed to tell you by clicking on the following video that shows up on the screen. See you in the next video, and may God bless you.